You know how for some people, music is a force that conveys meaning, it's soul music or gospel or that kind of thing? Well, for me, it was a smokescreen. And I used it like I was Havoc or maybe Dazzler from the comic books. I studied the sound of people speaking, and I figured, why not pitch your voice to get a certain response? You could call it a code switch or call it acting, but I figured if your voice is an instrument, then you should calibrate it. That's how I became the kid who spoke so softly you had to lean in to hear me. And that's although I was raised by the loudest, most outspoken Caribbean family, or maybe just a typical Caribbean family. I used to raise the pitch of my voice, kind of like a closeted gay person might lower theirs, giving people what I thought they wanted, which was this, or once in a while this. Like any other immigrant's kid, I did everything I could to not reveal my story. I didn't think it was glamorous enough, for one thing. Nobody died swimming to America from Vietnam or wherever for their freedom. It wasn't dramatic enough either, because I wasn't one of the 2 Chinese kids in 6th grade who wore the same pair of pants every day and probably worked till midnight at a restaurant or whatever, getting straight A's all the while. It wasn't even a particularly exotic story, since Spanish speakers were a dime a dozen in Crown Heights back then. All anybody knew about Jamaica, where my mom was from, was that's where Bob Marley came from, and Peter Tosh, and probably a bunch of other dudes who smoked weed all day. Back then, no one was talking about cultural hiccups like the egregious male chauvinism that also came with my parents and anything that concerned my brother and me. So I avoided sounding like the kid of immigrants because it seemed to me that sounding like almost anyone else was better. I knew if I tried to stand out, I'd leave an impression. So if I didn't try, I figured maybe I could just get by.